Okay, so this is the second in our series. We are talking about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nittai HaArbeli. This again is a continuation of our ongoing series. We've been discussing the earliest rabbis of the sages, earliest rabbis of the of any time, the first generations of rabbis. Spotlight on Chazal is what we've called this series, and additionally, this series has been focused on rabbis who were active, who were productive, who operated during the time of the Chashmonoim, during the times of the Hasmoneans, during the time of the rebellion, the Maccabean rebellion, and the subsequent period. If I was given to perhaps more controversial titles, I would have given this class the title Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, Jesus's rabbi, because Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, at least according to the Talmud, was the rabbi of Jesus. But I'm not given to that sort of thing, so it did not go into any of our publications. But let that seed be planted in your mind as you think about this further. And we'll continue. We'll go and we'll discuss Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia. Who was he? What was he doing? What was he up to? What was he? And what were his political contexts? And what does he perhaps teach us about Jewish history and the change of values that perhaps was occurring during his day? So in order to first begin discussing Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, we have to know something about what he had to say. And our beginning point, our starting off point, is here from in Pirkei Avot, in Mishnayos Avos, and you should have the text right in front of you. You have Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, as well as his partner Nittai HaArbeli. Remember, this is during the time that we refer to as the period of the Zugim, or the period of the pairs, when rabbinic leadership was conducted in groups of two. This is the second generation. We had Yossi ben Yoezer last week. Here we have Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nittai HaArbeli. And here we start off in the very, very first chapter of Pirkei Avos. We have a recorded teaching from the two of them. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nittai HaArbeli kiblu mehem. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nittai HaArbeli, they received the oral tradition from the previously mentioned sources, again, was Yossi ben Yoezer, Shimon HaTzadik, and the men of the Great Assembly. Yehoshua ben Perachia Omer, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia used to say, or he says, Aseh l'chorav, make a teacher for yourself. Appoint a teacher for yourself is how it's translated here on the English side. U'kanei l'cha chaver, and acquire for yourself a friend. V'hevei don es kol adam l'kaf schus, and judge all men favorably. The idea here is that if you have different ways of interpreting a person's actions or behaviors, choose the better option, given the benefit of the doubt. Don't assume that this person is a sinner. Don't assume that this person had bad or ill intentions. Judge him or her favorably. Nittai HaArbeli Omer. However, Nittai HaArbeli says something which is perhaps a little bit starker in its language. Harchek mishachein ra. Distance yourself from a bad neighbor. V'al tischaber l'rasha. Don't join together. Don't become attached to a wicked person. And don't abandon faith in divine retribution. You might see that the wicked people are on the up and up. Don't be so convinced that that will be always the case. They will get their comeuppance someday at some point. So now that we've been introduced to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nittai HaArbeli, we have these two authorities that have just been quoted. Let's talk about who they were and their political context. As we moved on from last week's class, we started talking about the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty. It's very difficult to see on. Regrettably, I put it too high, but Matisyahu was the first Chashmonai. He was, maybe he wasn't the first Chashmonai, but he was a member of the Chashmonai house, which was a family of Kohanim. He's the one covered up by our interface here. You can't see it if you're here locally. Hopefully you at home can see it. Rabbi Matisyahu was the very first person of note within the Maccabean dynasty, or the Hasmonean dynasty. And his son, you can see right over here, below his name, that's Yehuda, that's Judas, Yehuda Maccabee. What's going on over here? The Hasmoneans were a family of Kohanim who essentially led as the leaders of the Jewish people of the country as a whole, who were acknowledged as the leadership from about the year 167, which is the beginning of the Maccabean rebellion, until into the very first century before the Common Era. This is a period of time that covers about 100 years or so, 130, 140 years or so. After the death of Yehuda Maccabee. You see here that he had a brother whose name was Jonathan or Yonasan. He continued leading the rebellion against the Seleucid Empire, against Demetrius. If you recall, Demetrius IV was the Seleucid emperor at the time. We were victorious in expelling them from Jerusalem, from the Beis HaMikdash, and that's what we celebrate on Hanukkah. But the war continued after that point. The war had not yet come to its conclusion. And after a grueling war, Yonasan, again, the brother of Yehuda Maccabee, the son of Mattisyahu Maccabee, was successful, and he was able to establish himself as a leader. And not only was he the leader of the Jewish community, he was also recognized by the Greeks as the representative authority person within the Judean hinterlands. Jonathan, with Greek consent, took up residence in a place called Michmash, which is about 10 kilometers north of Yerushalayim, and from there he established his capital, where he governed, he ruled over Eretz Yisrael. He ruled over Judea. A few years later, he was able to get concessions from the Greeks to allow him to, govern independently and perhaps be a part of the empire. He later threw his lot in with this guy over here, a man by the name of Alexander Balas, who was actually a Roman plant from a neighboring kingdom, who overthrew the Seleucid house and established himself as the emperor of the Seleucid Greek kingdom. So Yonasan, who was the leader of Judea at this time, he was the governor of the Jews, as it were. He gambled, he supported Alexander Balas, and this gambit turned out to be successful. Alexander Balas was successful in overthrowing the Seleucids. He did become the next Seleucid emperor, and he appointed Yehuda as the official Judean governor. And a great deal more of independence and autonomy was granted to the Jewish community within the land of Israel. Most notably, Yonasan was not a sign of the house of Tzadok. If you recall, we spoke about the various families of Kohanim. There were different families. There was Bilgas, we mentioned last week. There was the family of Tzadok. He was the Hashmonoi house. This was a family of Kohanim. He was not from the house of the Tzedukim. Now, the Tzedukim were the preeminent family from almost the entirety of the Greek period. Until this point, they had reigned supreme. The high priest was chosen from their family. The Kohen Gadol was always from that aristocratic leadership family. Here, Yonasan is appointed to be the high priest. He's appointed to be the Kohen Gadol by this gentleman by the name of Alexander Balas. And to a great extent, he was actually viewed as being nothing more than an illegitimate puppet high priest, like some of his predecessors. Because he was imposed from an outside authority, he was appointed to be the Kohen Gadol, and he was not from the preeminent family of Kohanim. So there was a certain amount of discomfort that the Kohanim had with him as leader. But, the fact remains that he still had that authority. He was imposed by the reigning emperor at the time. And from this point onwards, the Hasmonean family were the leaders, and they took charge of not only the Beis HaMikdash, but also with regards to leading the rebellion, foreign affairs. They determined foreign policy and made security agreements. We essentially have a concentration of secular and religious authority being combined in this single individual, this man, Jonathan, the son of Mattisyahu, the Hashmonoi high priest, or Kohen Gadol. Eventually he died, he passed away, and if we have to go back to the family tree, after Yonasan died, Mattisyahu's third son, Shimon, became the governor of the Jews. He was appointed high priest, Kohen Gadol, in his place, and he further established and consolidated the Hasmonean state. The climax of this period was the convening of a national assembly, essentially the forerunner of the Sanhedrin, that met in the temple courtyard and established the new leader's powers and authorities, granting him the authority to operate as an appointed leader of the Jewish people, not only from people on the outside, namely the emperor of the Seleucid Greek Empire, but locally, indigenously, he was also appointed to this very particular office. This assembly was asked to give formal recognition to the Hasmonean dynasty as the people's leader, a role equivalent to the king of the Jews, and as a dynasty of Kohanim, of high priests, and military commanders. With this appointment, they established a dynasty with all the branches of power. This is a further consolidation: foreign policy, the judiciary, religious authority, as well as the army, all combined and all being held by this one person. And then again is this guy right over here, Simon, or Shimon, the son of Matisyahu, the Chashmonai, the Hasmonean. Now he reigned for a pretty reasonable period of time. About 12 years or so, 142 BCE to 134 BCE. He eventually was assassinated by his son-in-law. His son-in-law, a guy by the name of Talmai ben Chibuv, wanted himself to be the emperor, the king of the Jews, and he assassinated his father. Shimon was visiting his son-in-law. This was in the town of Jericho, and a in-house coup was attempted, and he was killed again by his son-in-law. Now, this isn't the first time that this Talmai, the son-in-law of Shimon, attempted to assassinate somebody from the Hasmonean house. In fact, he tried murdering his brother, that's Yochanan, or Hyrcanus, as you see over here, in an effort to ensure that the reign of the Hasmonean house would pass to the son-in-law and not to the only son. Again, this guy being Yochanan. So this was a no good character, and it's kind of questionable as to why Shimon would go and spend and have a meal with his son-in-law, who was such a no-goodnik, who would be willing to assassinate his brother-in-law, his wife's brother, and now obviously attempting to assassinate his father-in-law in order to ensure that he becomes the next king of the Jews, as it were. Now, this attempted rebellion failed, and the people of Yehuda and Yerushalayim remained loyal to the Hasmonean dynasty and to then Yochanan, or Hyrcanus, also known as John, who reigned for a very long time, close to 30 years. Now, Yochanan was appointed the king to succeed Shimon, his father. And of all the Hasmonean leaders, of all the Chashmonaim, it was Yochanan Hyrcanus who, more than any other, extended or expanded the borders of the then Jewish state. And here you have a picture, or you have a map right in front of you. You have here Israel, and generally speaking, the territory that was governed by the Hasmonean house was rather small. It was really just Yerushalayim and its environs. He expanded the boundaries of Jewish-controlled territory, going over into the East Bank, and eventually also conquering much of the south, conquering the Edomite peoples, the nation of Edom, descendants of Esau, this past week's Parsha. This is the south of Israel. They conquered this entire territory. And Josephus relates that he allowed the Edomites, as we're going to call them, to remain on the land on the condition that they would undergo circumcision, they would have a bris milah, and that they would convert to Judaism. And this was a very serious problem that would plague the Hasmonean house for quite a period of time. In fact, it would ultimately be their undoing. But these Edomites to the south were always of questionable Jewish pedigree. You can't force somebody to convert to Judaism. The conversion is really questionable. And that was something that the Gemara, the Chachamim, all contended with. And in the Mishnayos, it also gets discussed. Were these people Jewish or not? They were called perhaps Geirei Arios, lions, converts of the lions, as it were. They were intimidated by lions to become Jewish. Is that considered to be a valid conversion? It's a very big question. But in any event, we see that the population was expanding, Jewish control was likewise expanding, and power was being centralized in this fighter, priest, monarchic character who was at this point anyways, the Yochanan or John or Hyrcanus of the Hasmonean house. It was during the 30 years of his rule that the Jews gained control over most of the internal parts of the land of Israel. From the Galilee, right about over here to the north, like right this area, all the way down to the Negev. You see that it's expanded, as I mentioned, into this other area as well. Now, this had already begun during the times of Yochanan's father, Shimon, and even during the time of his uncle, Yonasan, but no other king was as successful as he was in expanding the boundaries and incorporating larger portions, larger areas into the Jewish-governed, Jewish-controlled area of what was biblical Eretz Yisrael. And in fact, we actually find that the Seleucid ruler at this point, a man by the name of Antiochus VII, complained about the proliferation of Jewish settlement. And this was the letter that's recorded in the book of Maccabees. It was a letter that was written by, who is this again? It was Yochanan, wrote back to the emperor. We have neither taken any other man's land, nor do we hold dominion over other people's territory, but only over the inheritance of our fathers, which for a certain time was held unjustly by our enemies. Essentially, was saying we're just taking what is ours. Now, it would seem that by this time of the second generation of the Hasmonean rebellion, a religious awareness and hence a desire to settle all parts of the land, and not just Yerushalayim, had become more intense. Under Yochanan's reign, the country's population was once again Jewish and once again controlled large portions of what was considered to be biblical Eretz Yisrael. Now, at the beginning of his reign, Yochanan is considered to have been a rather righteous individual. He was considered to be someone that was operating within the view, how the Chazal viewed the parameters of halacha, who consulted with rabbinic leadership. He conducted himself in an appropriate way. He was largely viewed as being exceptionally righteous. And this is actually quite indicative. It's quite clearly indicated in several Mishnayos about several historical precedents that took place during his reign, during his 30 years reign. Here we have, for example, is a Mishnah from Meseches Para. It's talking here about the red heifer, the para aduma. Now, according to the Mishnah, there were only 7 red heifers that had ever been prepared in order to make use of them as part of the ritual of purification after coming in contact with the dead. There are only 7 such red heifers. And the Mishnah says over here, who are those who prepared them? Mi ason, who are the ones who took care of the red heifer, who saw to it that everything was conducted appropriately, and the ashes were there that were afterwards used to purify those who came in contact with the dead? Well, Shimon HaTzadik was one. We have another one, Yochanan Kohen Gadol. That's Yochanan Hyrcanus. That is the Chashmonai king at this point. Also Shtayim. Each one of them made 2. That's a total of 4. El Yehoenai ben Hakof, V'chan Me'el HaMitzri, V'yishmael ben Piovi, also achas. They all made one. They all made one respectively. We find this comes to the total of 7. So we see that, interestingly enough, there were very few recorded incidents of having a perfectly red heifer, and Yochanan Kohen Gadol was one such individual who had the honor of seeing to it that it was handled appropriately and correctly. We also see something else. Take a look at this mission over here. This is from Meister Sheni. Yochanan Kohen Gadol bitel es ha'me'orim. He abolished the wakers. What were the wakers? Well, whenever a sacrifice would be offered, the Leviim who would sing psalms, who would sing Tehillim, would recite a particular verse. O ye who slumbers, why do you sleep, O Lord? It's a verse from Tehillim. It's from the Mem Dalet. It's chapter 44. Well, what was the context of, what would be the reason why that verse would be recited? Well, the Gemara tells us that verse is speaking to a time when the nations of the world have it easy while the Jewish people are being persecuted. That's when that verse is appropriate. But under the days of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, under the days of Yochanan Hyrcanus, the Chashmonai king at the time, enough economic prosperity was reached, and Jews had enough sovereignty and control over their own destiny that it was no longer deemed appropriate to speak to a time when the Jewish people are suffering while the nations of the world have it easy. We see here that this was actually perhaps something of a golden era for the very early Jewish state. We also see something else. The Es HaNokfim, he did away with the Nokfim, with the beaters or the strikers. What's that a reference to? Well, that's a reference to Chol HaMoed. During Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days of a holiday, there are certain restrictions that are relaxed that are associated with the Yom Tov as a whole, right? On the Yom Tov days of Yom Tov, you're not supposed to do any kind of work, you're not supposed to do any kind of labor, but we're all familiar with how Chol HaMoed, you can go to work. The truth is that if you were to take a very close literature, it's not that simple. In general, I'm trying to figure out why I'm getting a message that the speakers have swapped out. Anyways, let's go back. During Chol HaMoed, we actually do say that if at all possible, one should not work. One should not work during Chol HaMoed. There is a loophole that says if you stand to lose your livelihood, you're not going to be able to financially make it. Well, then you are allowed to work on Yom Tov. But all things being equal, if a person's livelihood is what?
To work on Chol HaMoed.
Yes, that's right, exactly. So that being said, that being the case, what seems to be indicated over here is that during Chol HaMoed in the city of Yerushalayim, during the days of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, the Chashmonai leader, there was such economic prosperity that people were able to focus on the Yom Tov. It was deemed that it was not necessary for them to work on Yom Tov. So therefore, the hammer of construction, the hammer of craftsmanship on Chol HaMoed no longer beat, no longer banged. People stopped working on Chol HaMoed because they reached a point, and they reached a level of economic prosperity where their livelihood would not come to an end should they refrain from working on Chol HaMoed. So they stopped working on Chol HaMoed as a result. So this points to several factors. It points to a level of economic prosperity. It speaks to a level of stability that, they were confident about what was going to happen next week, next month, next year. And it also speaks to something of a religious awakening. People became much more conscious of our halachic obligations, ritual observances, and this seems to be a very, very positive development. This was a great time to be a Jew living in Israel. So, where does the problem develop? Well, the problem develops as Yochanan Kohen Gadol accrued more and more control and more authority. The tranquility of Yochanan's rule lasted for almost an entire generation, and the peace that he brought in, that he ushered in, reigned in Eretz Yisrael for almost the entire duration of his rule. This, again, as we mentioned, was the period of time when we are talking about Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nittai HaArbeli, who are this generation of pairs. The truth is, we don't know all that much about the intellectual, religious, and social activities of these two chachamim. We only really have one source, that speaks to this, that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia attempted to declare that all grain that came from the city of Alexandria should be considered impure, but that decree that he made was not adopted. That actually shines some light as to the nature of leadership that the pairs, the Zugim, had during this time. They weren't the out-and-out rabbinic rulers. They did not make decrees and everybody listened to what they had to say. They were perhaps first amongst equals, but they did not necessarily have the final word. Their opinion was important and was taken into consideration, but they could not make decrees that would automatically become the rule or the law of the land. And this was true within rabbinic leadership, but it was also true with regards to Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who eventually started moving further and further away from the rabbinic leadership and how he saw his role and what he thought he ought to do or how he ought to practice. And the very first breach that we actually do see between him and the Chachamim is this coin that is written in Paleo Hebrew, which is called Ksav Ivri in Hebrew. It's the old Hebrew script. Currently we use the Ksav Ashuri, the Assyrian script, but this was the old Hebrew script. This was a coin that was minted in his days. And on one hand, you have imagery that harkens to the Yerushalayim, the ram's horn that would be blown on Yom Kippur, on a Yovel. You have on the Hebrew side here the statement. What does it say? It says, Yochanan Kohen Gadol, Rosh La Yehudim, head of the Jews. He starts taking on the trappings of being the actual king. I've referred to him as the king. He wasn't exactly the king, but he starts adopting more and more aristocratic practices. This fighter priest is now the contemporary political leader, while the most prominent chachamim, on the other hand, seem to be pushed to the periphery. Nittai HaArbeli and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, as we're going to talk about, their base of power was in the Galilee, it was in the provinces, it was in the hinterland. It wasn't in Yerushalayim, the center of this new Jewish empire. Yerushalayim was the center of the Chashmonai house, but the Chachamim were gradually being pushed out from their authority and their positions of legal and religious leadership. We also find, for example, it's at this time that there was a new law that was promulgated that all documents, like bills of sale, like loan documents, all kinds of, anything legal that requires dating, it should now be dated from the year that Yochanan ascended to become the Kohen Gadol, priest to Kael Elyon. The language of Sefer Bereshis, Malki Tzedek, Kohen, Melech Sholem, Kohen La'el Elyon. He starts adopting certain trappings. He starts calling himself, essentially using the moniker, the title of this ancient king of Yerushalayim. He starts adopting that himself, so that when now documents are dated, according to this law, they have to be dated from the time that he ascended to power, using biblical language that implies that he is the king of Jerusalem. We have many, many sources from this time. We have an ancient work called the Megillas Ta'anis, which is a lista. It's an ancient document that contains lists of happy occasions and sad occasions. It predates the Mishnah. It's really, really old. We have the book of the Maccabees. We have the Gemara. We have Josephus. We have all these sources pointing to a growing tension between this king priest figure who is adopting more of the trappings of being the monarch, being this aristocratic, autocratic ruler, and the disfavor that he held Chazal, who essentially he viewed as people who stood in his way of gaining more power, and the Chachamim themselves, who viewed him with growing suspicion. Yochanan eventually, according to Chazal, according to the Talmud, defected outright to the Tzedukim, further aggravating this tension. The overall result being this incredible crisis, this chasm that really opened, that could no longer be bridged between Yochanan and the Chachamim, Yochanan and the rabbinic leaders of the day. And in fact, we actually have a reference to this in the Gemara, starting off with the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah in Perachia. Hillel says, don't trust yourself. Don't rely on yourself. Don't be so sure that you will never turn away from righteousness. Don't say, I'm above my Yetzer Hara, I will not fall. Don't say that until you day the diet. It's always a battle. You never know. A person, even late in life, can turn from the right and up and proper path. And the example that the Gemara gives is Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Shimesh b'kahuna gedola shmona yashana. He was the Kohen Gadol for 80 years. Ulevasof nasa tzedoki. And at the end, he became a tzedoki. He became a Sadducee. He became something of a heretic. Now, we spoke about the tzedukim last week. In the previous discussion, we spoke about who they were. These were the priestly leaders who essentially wanted to reestablish the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, as the center of all Jewish life, and that the authority for the Jewish people should be the leadership, the people who operate, who govern the Beis HaMikdash. So though Yochanan Kohen Gadol was not a Tzeduki in terms of his lineage, he was not from that house, he was a Chashmonai, his concentration of power in his own hands, while being an anathema to the Pharisees, to the Perachia, to us, rabbinic Jews, this was actually what the Sadducees always wanted. They were very sympathetic, and they felt that within him, they had the opportunity to reestablish the Beis HaMikdash as the source of political and religious and social power. The Chachamim claimed that Yochanan Kohen Gadol became a Tzeduki. It's possible that he outright did, but it may be possible also that he did not necessarily take on the theological trappings of the Tzedukim. Rather, he found allies amongst the Tzedukim. We also find that within Josephus, there is a charge that is lobbed at him. The rabbis of the day, Josephus says, essentially say to him, let the crown of royalty suffice for you. Leave the crown of priesthood to the seed of Aaron. Essentially, we find that the Chachamim start saying there are two crowns at play. You can be one or the other. You can be the political leader or you can be the religious leader. You could be the king or you could be the high priest. You can't be both. Choose one or the other. Well, the Tzedukim would argue, no. It's exactly how it should be. The priests should always be the rulers and the governors of the land of Israel. Now, the truth is that I've quoted Josephus as the recording that this was a charge that was made against Yochanan Kohen Gadol, or John Hyrcanus, the high priest, the governor of Judea. But the truth is that we actually do see that the Gemara similarly has a recorded tradition of a claim or an accusation being made that is word for word, verbatim, the same as what Josephus says. And here we have the Gemara here. This is in Kedushin. It says that an evil and worthless scoffer named Elazar ben Peorah said to Yanai. In last week's class, I also explained that Yanai became the moniker, the name for all wicked kings. We're now talking about Yochanan Kohen Gadol. King Yanai, the Pharisees are plotting against you. Well, then, what should I do? Well, test them by wearing the garb of the Kohen Gadol in their presence. So that's what he did. He wore the tzitz, which is the golden crown, the golden plate that was worn on the Kohen Gadol's forehead, and he wore it in their presence, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, at a meeting with the rabbinic leadership. Now, an elder by the name of Yehuda, the son of Gedidiah, was present, and he said to the king, "O King Yanai, let the royal crown suffice for you, and leave the priestly crown to the seat of Aharon." There was some question about whether he was actually of priestly lineage, beyond the scope of our discussion. And the Chachamim departed in anger. Then Elazar ben Peorah said to the king, "O Yanai, what are you going to do about this? That's the law even for the most humble men in Israel, but you're a king and the high priest. Shall that be the law for you too?" Basically says, these people are disrespecting you. What are you going to do about it? Well, the king said, "Well, what shall I do? Well, if you take my advice, trample them down. If so, then what's going to happen to the Torah?" So you see here, despite the fact that he was probably identifying with the Tzedukim in terms of achieving and accumulating greater power, he was not necessarily given over to Tzeduki theology, because the question is, well, what's going to happen to the Torah? To which he said, well, it's lying in the corner. Whoever wishes to study it, let him go and study. Now, this was actually perhaps the wrong call to be made. Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak said immediately the spirit of heresy was instilled into him, for he should have replied, well, that only works if somebody wants to read what it actually says in the Torah. But what are you going to do about understanding what it means, the oral law? Straight away, what's that? Torah Sheba'al Peh, yeah. Evil burst forth from Elazar, the son of Peorah. All the sages of Israel were massacred, and the world was desolate until Shimon ben Shetach came and restored the Torah to its pristine stature. That's the next generation. All right, so we actually do see that, at least from the Gemara's perspective, Yochanan, the Chashmonai, was evil to the core. He was wicked to the core. He was a downright, absolute, unequivocal, no good Nick. So the conclusion emerging from all these sources that I've mentioned, you have the Megillas Tainus, Josephus, Talmudic literature, they all have criticism for Yochanan for attempting to concentrate the powers of religion and state into one office, and this was his primary burden to bear. This was his project. This is what he was responsible for. He was ultimately responsible for the outcome. Now, the truth is that, I've mentioned the Book of the Maccabees. The Book of the Maccabees is unequivocal in its support for the Chashmonaim. It is definitely very laudatory, but the Book of the Maccabees also seems to have some criticism also for Yochanan and his attempt to combine the crown of civil and religious leadership into the same office. In later years, this period and this criticism became clearer and clearer. And here you have, for example, a text in front of you from the Ramban, Nachmanides, where he's talking about the verse. It's a verse in Parshas Vayechi where Yaakov is giving his final blessing to the Shvatim, to the tribes, to his sons, and he speaks about the tribe of Yehuda. The scepter shall never leave his hand is the language that's used. So this is what the Ramban Nachmanides says, and he says it probably the clearest of anyone. This was also the reason for the punishment of the Hasmoneans who reigned during the Second Temple. They were saints of the Most High, without whom the study of Torah and the observance of the commandments would have been forgotten in Israel. Yet despite this, they suffered great punishment. The four sons of the old Hasmonean Matisyahu were saintly men who ruled one after the other, but in spite of their bravery and prowess, they fell by the sword of their enemies. Ultimately, the punishment reached the stage where our rabbis of blessed memory says anyone who says, I come from the house of the family of the Hasmoneans, we have to assume they might have come from the household of the Hasmoneans, meaning from the slaves of the Hasmoneans, of the Chashmonaim, because none of the Chashmonaim were left living after everything was said and done. Eventually, one of their Edomite slaves slew them and took over control, that being Herod's father. I'm trying to remember his name. Drawing a blank on it right now. I used to know it. Anyways, but we're talking about those Edomians that I mentioned earlier, the Edomites that were forcibly converted. They ultimately proved to be the downfall of the house of the Chashmonaim. They were destroyed on account of this sin. It says in the Talmud Yerushalmi, we have the following text: we do not appoint priests as kings. Rabbi Yehuda Anturia says this is on account of the verse, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. Again, it's Nachmanides, it's the Ramban in Sefer Bereshis. All right, let us continue. So now we've talked about the historical context. We've spoken about what was going on, who the people were. These people were. We also know about the challenges of the rivalry that was raging at this time between the rabbinic leadership and the Chashmonoim, the Hasmonean house. Let's now talk about Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nittai HaArbeli. Now, certain traditions attempt to identify Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nittai HaArbeli as being active in the Lower Galilee. Now, that's a very easy claim to make for Nittai HaArbeli, because if you take a look at this map, it's kind of hard perhaps to see on the screen in front of me, but you have over here Arbel, which is right by the Sea of Galilee. He's Nittai HaArbeli. He's obviously from this region. The assumption is that he operated in this region as well. We spoke about this last week. People were identified by the places they came from, if that typified something about who and what they were. There's also an attempt to assume that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia also came from this region. There is a grave next to Nittai HaArbeli's grave that is said to be the grave of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia. The only problem, though, is that for much of history, that grave was identified not as the grave of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, rather as the grave of Yehoshua ben Nun, the biblical Yehoshua, the prophet or the judge, that's the Sefer Yehoshua. That's probably not correct, though, because he was buried near Shechem, according to the text, which is way further to the south. You can't see it on the screen because the map doesn't go that far south. So perhaps there was some tradition. There was some guy named Yehoshua. Originally, it was Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia. It was thought to be Yehoshua, the Moshe's successor. But in more recent centuries, it's been assumed that grave actually is, in fact, the grave of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia. In dating the activities of Yehoshua ben Perachia, we have a contradiction between the historical continuity, the continuity of the Zugim, of these pairs of rabbinic leaders, and Talmudic tradition. The chronology of the pairs would have them be contemporaries of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who reigned from 134 to 104 BCE, before the Common Era. The first pair, Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan, they were active during the outbreak of the Maccabean rebellion in the year 167. Yossi ben Yoezer was killed by his nephew, Yocham Ish Tsururos, the Hellenist priest alchemist in the time of Dimitri IV. And Shimon ben Shetach, of the leader of the third pair of rabbinic leaders, was the next generation who was active during the time of King Yanai. In fact, he was Yanai's brother-in-law, which was the 1st century BCE, the 1st century. So that would actually place these two individuals between the year 150 and the year 100 before the Common Era. Yet the Talmudic tradition actually places Yehoshua ben Perachia a century later as the teacher of Yashka, as the teacher of Jesus. And we'll talk more about that momentarily. But let us talk now about Nittai HaArbeli. Let's examine what he said. What did he say? He said, distance yourself from a bad neighbor, don't join together with the wicked, and don't abandon faith in divine retribution. This teaching of Nittai HaArbeli perhaps reflects his reaction to the persecution of the Chachamim at the hands of the Chashmonoim, and he warns against over-familiarity with bad neighbors, forming alliances, or consorting with the wicked. And from the heights of his residence in the Galilee, his message is that he has nothing to do with Jerusalem. He does no interest in collaborating with the people who live there. He does not want to be involved. He does not want to engage in the political squabbles, create alliances, even to achieve his own noble ends. He wants to sit back in Galilee and have nothing to do with Yerushalayim, and not abandon faith in divine retribution, that these people's comeuppance will take place at some point later on. His main compatriot, however, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, his partner, perhaps because he was more involved in the goings-on in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, had to flee persecution to Alexandria in Egypt. At a point, King Yanai who's purported, at least Yochanan here, who killed out the Chachamim, killed out the sages, ultimately made an attempt to reconcile with the rabbinic leadership. And maybe this took place in the subsequent generation, the time of Shimon ben Shattach, because Shimon ben Shattach was able to convince Yanai to allow the Chachamim to come back. So maybe Yochanan passes away, his son Yanai has taken control, and now Yanai, in an attempt to bring the rabbis back to the table, under the influence of his brother-in-law, Shimon ben Shattach, allowed Shimon ben Shattach to send a letter to Yehoshua ben Perachia asking him to come back. And this is what it says. When King Yanai slew our rabbis, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia and Jesus fled to Alexandria in Egypt. When peace was restored, Shimon ben Shattach sent this message to him: from Jerusalem, the holy city, to Alexandria. Oh, my sister, city to city, talking here. Oh, my sister, my husband is dwelling in your midst, and I am left all alone. I am desolate. So he's basically saying, please send my husband back, saying, Yehoshua ben Perachia, please come back. And the story continues. Rabbi Yehoshua arose and came back and lodged in a certain inn where they paid him great respect. He said, wow, this hostess here, the innkeeper, this woman innkeeper, this Aksanya, this inn hostess, she is great. She's really treating me well. I'm really appreciative to the welcome that I've received. Well, in Hebrew, the welcoming that you received uses the same turn of phrase, which talks to a woman's attractiveness, which Yashka said back to him, how can you find that woman attractive? She has bad eyes. Her eyes are narrow. They're bleary. Sometimes it gets translated. So while Rabbi Shimon ben Perachia was talking about the demeanor and the welcome that he received, Yashka assumed he was talking about how attractive she was as a woman. Well, Rabbi Shimon ben Perachia didn't like that. And he says, that's what you immediately think about? That's where your thoughts go to? The attractiveness of this person or that woman? So he excommunicated him. Later, the disciple, Yashka, or Jesus, came to him repeatedly pleading, receive me, please let me come back. I want to be your student again. But he paid him no heed. One day, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia was reciting the Shema. Yashka, Jesus, came before him. He intended to receive him, and he motioned him with his hand, yes, you can come back now. But the sign was ambiguous. Yashka thought that he was rebuffing him again. And what does he do? So he went up, set up a brick, and started worshiping it. He became an idolater. So this was still his student. Rabbi Yehoshua cared about him, and he sent him a letter, said, please, come back, repent, do teshuvah. You can come back and you can study and be again, but you should repent. But Yashka answered back to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, I've received this tradition from you. This is what you said, that one who sins and causes other to sin is denied the opportunity to repent. He's denied the opportunity to repent. There's no hope for me according to your own rubric, according to your own teachings. There's no hope for me. I'm going to stay here and worship my bricks. You go back and do whatever it is that you want to do. And this is the conclusion. This is the story of how Jesus was perhaps cast out from the world of Judaism, let's say. All right, now let's talk about what the story actually represents. It's possible this is a literal story, maybe, but it might also be a metaphor describing Yehoshua ben Perachia's return to leadership. The Sanhedrin, or the hostess, receives him with great fanfare, but Jesus directs his attention to the bleary eyes of the hostess, the eyes of the community, meaning the community leadership. They were a decrepit body. The family of the Nasi at the time, or at least at the time this is presumed to have happened, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's grandson was corrupt, leadership was unstable, and something was not right. So Yashka was responding to the leadership. He was saying, I'm being welcomed back so well. I'm so happy to be here. Having received a warm welcome, Yehoshua ben Perachia treated the hostess, the Jewish leadership of the time, politely, observing their overall demeanor and accepting them cheerfully without subjecting them to meticulous examination. But Jesus could not accept his teacher's well-mannered treatment of the hostess, or the Jewish leadership of the day. If the eyes are faulty, then the entire body needs to be examined. If the leadership is decrepit, if the leadership is corrupt, that must mean that the entirety of the society is corrupt as well. Now, this was a very serious problem for Yehoshua ben Perachia. He had a student who was essentially going to become a muckraker, who had bad eyes of his own. He was disgruntled. He was always looking to tarnish the leadership and create problems. This would be someone who just could not operate in society and would always be a thorn in the side of the leadership of the day. he excommunicated him. Such an individual could have no place in the community. Now, not content to merely retell the story, the Talmud adds its own evaluation. And this dictum shows up where this story is recounted. It says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, La'olam tehe simol docha v'yamin mikareves, lo ke'elisha shedochafu l'geichazi b'shtei yodayim, v'lo k'Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia shedochafu l'yeshu b'shtei yodayim. Always, if you're going to rebuke somebody, push with your weak hand, your left hand, while still holding onto them with the right. Don't push them away with both of their hands. If you push them away with both of their hands, there's no hope for any return. If you're going to rebuke somebody, if you're going to punish somebody, make sure that they still have a place in your community. Use your strong hand to hold them close. Don't do what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia did, who pushed away Yashka with both of his hands, or like Elisha did to Gehazi. Now, let's take a look again at the text of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia said, appoint for yourself a teacher and acquire for yourself a companion and judge all men with the scale weighted in their favor. Let's take a look at what the Lubavitcher Rebbe says. This is from the Likutei Sichos. The Lubavitcher Rebbe writes this, and what he essentially does is he connects this teaching with the story of Yashka, with the story of Jesus, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia and Jesus. The explanation is that the Talmud intended to warn even against the kind of rejection perpetrated by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia. For it's clear that when dealing with Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, it's inconceivable that he was motivated by personal considerations and the like. Furthermore, even after rejected Yashka, he made an attempt to bring him near. Nevertheless, we should be wary of this kind of rejection. So when we look in the Mishnah, when he says judging each man favorably, this is him evolving as a leader and learning about the frailty of his hardline approach that he had adopted with Nittai HaArbeli. If you recall, Nittai HaArbeli said, cut off all evildoers, set them away, get them out of your midst, don't have anything to do with them, and don't despair of divine retribution. That will come to those wicked people. Stay in the Galilee, leave the people in Jerusalem to rot. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia is saying something markedly different over here, and perhaps this was born, as the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, of his experience with Yashka. When you push too strongly, even somebody who perhaps has some innate goodness within them. Every person has some goodness in them. You push them too harshly, you push them too far away, there's no hope that they would ever be brought back within the fold. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia understood the consequences of his original teaching, and this revised teaching was intended to establish a framework for transmitting Torah while engendering an adherence to responsibility. He says, you should judge each man favorably, yet at the same time, appoint a teacher for yourself, have some rabbinic leadership in your life, and have friends who will help guide you. That has to come alongside judging each man favorably. According to the Lubavitcher Rebbe's interpretation, what we ought to do is extract the inherent good in each person. There's no such thing as a person who's completely evil. A person can be restored to the correct path by finding the point of goodness within them, and through that point of goodness, the person can continue to perhaps move on a trajectory to ultimately become entirely good. And that way, perhaps the statement, judge every man, shouldn't be read every man, but rather judge all of a man, judge a man in his totality in a positive, favorable way. So again, when we take a look at these two statements side by side, Nittai HaArbeli, who says, stay away from evildoers, don't become attached to the wicked, and don't abandon faith in retribution. We see Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia says something markedly different. He says, alongside appointing for yourself a teacher, acquiring for yourself a companion, judge all men with the scale weighted in his favor. The dispute between Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nittai HaArbeli revolves around the question of how to confront misfortune and calamity. Nittai HaArbeli, who says distance yourself from a bad neighbor and don't become friends with a wicked person, was understood as a guideline. In a world in which evil is rampant, one must seek fortification in a place of refuge, remote from the centers of evil influence. But this view was countered by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, who taught, attain for yourself a teacher, acquire for yourself a friend, judge each man favorably, that is, with proper help, with rabbinic guidance and a strong attachment to friends, as well as searching for the good in oneself and one's surroundings, one can guide each individual and the world as a whole down the correct path. This was his revised teaching, acquired in the wake of his failure with his pupil, Yashka, Jesus, this being a critical juncture in Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia's philosophy. And this concludes the class, and I will now stop the recording, and I'm open for questions, comments, and rebuttals.